Good evening, everyone. So, welcome to one of the talks connected to our uncommon people exhibition, what we call the folk exhibition. So tonight, I'm delighted to introduce Claire Slack, our engagement officer, who's going to talk to us about trees that tell tales. So, over to you, Claire.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. I made that a tongue twister just for you, by the way. Thank you, as always, David, for having me along. It's a real pleasure to talk about my research where I work as well, which is really lovely. Now, as David said, my name is Claire Slack. I am a folklorist by trade. I'm also the engagement officer right here at Wiltshire Museum. I'm very lucky to be part of the Assizes for Devices project, which over the next few years, we're working to hopefully move the museum into the Devices Assize Court building that's currently derelict. But I've also been lucky enough to be a very small part of our current folkloric exhibition, which is Uncommon People, Folk Culture in Wessex. If you haven't already been along to that, that's on until the 6th of September, and I really do recommend popping in for a visit. It's a really fantastic exhibition. Now, how I became a folklorist. Having completed my MA in folklore studies a few years ago now during COVID, where I studied everything from mushroom lore in Polish diasporic communities to bathroom graffiti in punk club bathrooms, all through a folkloric lens, I'm now most of the way through a professional doctorate in heritage, where I'm exploring contemporary ritual engagements with historic sacred sites. And these range from Neolithic long barrows to rivers and ancient woodlands. So the folklore of the natural world is something that's always really captured my interest, and having spent several years working in a historic woodland cemetery where I spent most of my time amongst the trees, it was very much part of my day-to-day life. Whether that was using things like storm-felled trees to craft Welsh love spoons, or telling stories of trees' places in Victorian morning rituals, this real passion for tree lore and how we use the stories of trees to both protect them and increase public knowledge of their place in our landscape and our society, it's only flourished over the years. So today I'm going to be taking you on a whistle-stop tour of the folklore and cultural heritage found within our British treescape. So I'm going to start by looking at what makes forests or woodlands special and why we as human beings find them magical and inspiring. We'll then journey through some of our most intriguing woodland spaces as I share stories found amongst the trees that reside there. We're going to look at some stories that are kind of about the ancient and wild, but I'm also going to look at contemporary legends and modern rituals that take place around them, so there'll be some balance here. Now, for the second half of this talk, I'm going to look more specifically at the folklore of individual trees, which are often the oldest or most interesting to be found in our woodland landscapes. I'm going to look at what makes a tree ancient or noteworthy, the stories that develop around them, and how these stories can be used to save our trees from the threats of redevelopment, but also talk about some of the dangers that can come with this kind of tourism and attraction to them. So I imagine I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes today, and I'll happily take some questions at the end, but I'm just going to warn you all that I am not a botanist, I'm not an ecologist, I am a folklorist, so I know far more about beliefs and traditions surrounding trees than woodland management or identification, just to give you a heads up right now. So trees have always played an important role in the British landscape and have been an important part of the lives of the people that have lived amongst them. So trees provide things like food, shelter, and of course the air we breathe. But the presence of trees, and with them our woodlands and forests, have always shaped the personality of the landscape around us. Before anyone asks, the difference between a woodland and a forest is simply of scale and the denseness of the canopy, although historically a forest would have referred to an area of rural hunting ground specifically, but that's changed a lot over time. Woodlands and forests have got a really fascinating cultural history that I really recommend a book called Oak and Ash and Thorn by Peter Fyans, if anyone wants to dive further into that once they've listened to this talk. Now, the way we manage our trees and woodlands kind of sculpts our landscape and creates the difference between regal parks, country hedgerows, lonely single trees, or the wildest of woodlands. And humans have been crafting their own wooded landscapes for millennia. So the earliest historical evidence of woodland management is found back in the Mesolithic period, so we're talking deep in pre-recorded history. And the idea of Britain being covered in this kind of unmanaged wild wood is in itself something of what I think of as a quite beautiful myth, but a myth nonetheless. And a lot of our most treasured woodlands were not established till the early 20th century. So that's when the Forestry Commission was formed to restore many of the woodlands that were lost due to timber felling in World War I. So they're a lot more contemporary than we often think of. Now, from a practical point of view, our woodlands and forests provide vital habitats for things like wildlife and plant life, as well as peaceful places for communities to escape the busy lives that the majority of us do lead these days. So to me, they're spaces of recreation, learning, exercise, love, mindfulness, and even spirituality for a lot of British people. Now, of course, the inspiration drawn from woodlands doesn't end in our history. Woodlands and forests regularly set the scene for imaginary landscapes as well as real ones. And the folklore of the forest regularly pops up in things like novels, movies, video games, just so much of our contemporary media, really. Woodlands and forests can remind us of the dangers of the unknown and of being outside our safe spaces. So I've shown a couple of examples here, which include the Forbidden Forest in the world of Harry Potter, for those of you who are familiar. The other picture is of the tree-filled backdrop to the 2015 horror The Hollow. And you can also find this in a host of things like Disney productions, such as Into the Woods, where the woods are this place of fear and horror. Now, woods can also represent adventure, safety, abundance, and an escape to magical worlds, as woodlands provide for the characters' wants and needs as well as their fears. So the least threatening forest I could think of was the Hundred Acre Woods of Winnie the Pooh fame. But there are also things like a lot of young adult fantasy books will use the woods as kind of an imagery of home and safety. So something called Beyond the Deep Woods that I read when I was younger, the main character Twig leaves the safety of the woodlands behind to pursue his treacherous journey. So they really are kind of indicative of the moment in that character's life. Now, the folkloric creatures of our forest often make an appearance in pop culture as well. So going back to Harry Potter, almost all of the creatures that feature in the Forbidden Forest take their roots from the folklore of cultures across the globe. So we have things like centaurs, unicorns, trolls, and werewolves, and they all take inspiration from our stories and beliefs. And many of them have origins in things like warning children to stay away from the dangers of our landscape, whether things like woods, rivers, or ravines. I could talk all evening about the way in which folklore in the forest has inspired pop culture, but I just wanted to give you a couple of examples before we move on to specifically exploring British folklore of forests and woodlands. Now, in 2025, it's estimated that around 3.28 million hectares of Britain are covered in forest and woodland. So that, just to give you an idea, represents about 13.5% of the country. This is a slight increase in previous years, but we are so far off our national targets for woodland creation, and we are at an increasing risk due to pests and diseases, so things like ash dieback, Dutch elm disease, and of course to redevelopment. So there's constant threats to our wooded landscape. Of the wooded spaces that we do have, there are hundreds and hundreds of separate woodlands and forests, and they each have their own personality. So some are ancient native woodlands, which are made up of things like pine, hazel, oak, and alder, whereas others are relatively new, like I said earlier, planted within the last 100 years. And you'll often see these thriving with things like holly, ash, hornbeam, and beech. So each brings its own ecosystems, wildlife, potentially an otherworldly appearance, and of course, folklore. So folklorically, Britain's forests and woodlands are believed to be the home of, and this is just a scattering of examples, terrifying giants, mysterious creatures, mischievous fairies, headless ladies, ancient battles, risky liaisons, and notorious crimes. And this is just really beginning to touch on the stories that other woodland landscapes have inspired. These stories have often been kept alive as generations have passed them between families and communities, sometimes in the form of fireside tales and sometimes in everyday rituals that are meant to protect us from the monsters that hide in the darkness of the undergrowth. So there are stories of wicked fairies who are beaten back by the crossing of water, so things like Jeannie, the Boggle of Mulgrave Wood up near Whitby, or for those of you who are lost in the woods and being led off by pixies, if you turn your clothes inside out, you can avoid being led off. We hear this in Ruth Tongue's 1961 account of a woman in the woods near Budleigh Salterton who became lost for hours in the dark woodland that she knew so well. So, of course, a lot of these stories have been written down at one point or another in attempts to save our cultural heritage, with varying degrees of adaptation, depending on the collector's creative influence. And there are hundreds of great books out there if anyone wants to explore it further. And I will make a couple of recommendations at the end of this talk. So I'm going to start off our journey around Britain's folkloric forests at one of our most famous, Sherwood. I'm sure all of you have heard of Sherwood Forest. Now, Sherwood Forest is a massive 1,000 acres of forest, and it's been wooded since the end of the last glacial period. It was once part of a royal hunting forest, as I mentioned earlier. I think this was established somewhere around the 10th century. Now, Sherwood Forest, as I'm sure some of you may well know, is known for tales of Robin Hood, which most people have come across in one way or another, be it in films like Robin Hood's Prince of Thieves, Disney's Robin Hood, or where I first encountered the tale, which was that really silly 90s kids programme Maid Marian and Her Merry Men, which I think was written by Tony Robinson. Fabulous. We'll keep coming back to Sherwood Forest throughout this talk, as it really is one of the most famous forests in the UK, and it certainly has some of the most famous trees, so we'll come back to that later. Now, according to the legend, Robin Hood was an outlaw who lived in Sherwood Forest, and he and his gang of men have become one of Britain's most famous kind of anti-heroes. As I'm sure you all know, robbing from the rich to give to the poor. He's also known for being a famous archer who could beat absolutely any challenger. Now, what's interesting about a legend like Robin Hood, rather than what we might call a myth or a folk tale, is that a legend generally has some basis in historical fact, although these facts are rarely authenticated, as we see with Robin Hood, but we also see with stories like those surrounding King Arthur. And over the years, there's been a lot of folklorists and historians who've tried to prove the existence of Robin Hood and authenticate the story, but the truth of this legend really is a subject of a lot of debate, even into the 2025s. It's generally accepted, especially in modern pop culture, that Robin Hood lived in England during the reign of Richard the Lionheart, so during the 12th century. However, the first literary reference to Robin Hood didn't appear till 1377, so there's some kind of disagreement there. Some chroniclers say he fought in the Crusades alongside the Lionheart before returning to England to find his lands seized by the evil Sheriff of Nottingham. So whether this is true or not, Sherwood Forest has certainly been home to its fair share of outlaws and bandits. One area of the forest here is known as Thieves Wood, which is where the King's Highway once ran through, and it's said that a lot of unlucky travellers met grisly ends there. So there's an infamous story of a girl named Bessie Shepherd who was murdered on the road by Thieves Wood in 1817. This area is still kind of well known in Nottinghamshire today, as is the story. Now, the story goes that she was walking home from Mansfield after successfully finding employment in service, and was attacked by a Mr. Charles Rotherham, who was an ex-soldier from Sheffield, who beat her with a hedge stake until she was dead before throwing her in a ditch and stealing both her shoes and an umbrella. Rotherham was found guilty and hanged on Gallows Hill, which is nearby. And to add to the story, a stone that was resurrected at her place of death is said to move and is said to summon the ghost of the murdered girl. Not that I've tested this, but just so you've got the full story. Now, next we're going to travel down the country to somewhere a bit closer to us, Savernake Forest, which is just a few miles from where I'm joining you from tonight. Now, the first written record of Savernake Forest appears in 934 AD, and this forest was also a royal hunting ground, much like Sherwood Forest became soon after. It is currently in private ownership, but it is open to the public if you wish to visit, and I think it's well worth the trip. It's one of my favourite places to walk locally. Savernake also contains the largest concentration of veteran trees in Europe, so a walk through Savernake, you'll never struggle to find an interesting sight in the form of these beautiful ancient gnarled trees. Now, the most famous of these is the Big Belly Oak, which you can conveniently see from the A346 as you drive by. Now, possibly due to the otherworldly appearance of the many ancient trees that you'll find in Savernake Forest, which is something we'll look into a bit more later, this forest is full of tales of ghosts, hounds, and spooky happenings. So according to the Swindon Advertiser, which I'll admit might not be the most reliable of sources, but if you were to dance naked anti-clockwise around the oldest and most haggard tree in Savernake, you'll summon the devil. Though I think with the A road that close, you might be in more danger of summoning the police, so I'm not going to advise that anyone tries that one. Now, according to author and parapsychologist Peter Underwood, the forest is also home to a lot of ghosts, including a headless lady who rides a white horse through the trees. Now, he suggested that she's said to be the ghost of a girl who was decapitated when her horse bolted through the trees that then grew everywhere during a long ago royal hunting party. There's also some stories that suggest that she's the ghost of Jane Seymour, who is the short-lived third queen of Henry VIII, although given that she was one of the lucky ones that kept her head, this seems unlikely to me. Now, Savernake Forest is also reported to be the home of several black dogs, which are a common appearance for British folklore, and if you see a black dog, it's said to bring you ill fortune or death to any witnesses. There are also reports of a ghostly white deer and an ethereal coach and horses which travel through the forest before disappearing to a nearby farm. Now, travelling further south still, my last example of folklore, which is attached to kind of generally our forests, and Mornan Wood in Cornwall. I'm really sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. So whilst my other examples talk of stories that hark back kind of hundreds of years, sometimes even thousands of years, not all the folklore that we talk about when we're talking about tree lore is filled with ancient mystery. Not all of it's passed down through generations, and modern stories, to me anyway, can be just as exciting and just as relevant to our cultural heritage. So this story centres on St Mornan and St Stephen's Church, which is a place that's surrounded by woodland not far from the village of Mornan Smith, which is near Falmouth. It's a quiet, peaceful place, has a relatively tiny woodland, and it certainly doesn't conjure this otherworldly image that the likes of Savernake and Sherwood's ancient trees might bring with them. Now, the first reported sighting of the owlman, which we're going to talk about today, was in April 1976, when two young girls, aged 12 and 9, spotted a feathered monster hovering above the tower of the old church whilst on holiday. Now, as you can see from the slide I've put here, the girls drew a sketch of what they'd seen for the local police, and then cut their holiday short because the girls were so terrified they simply couldn't stay anymore. As you can see, the owlman's said to be about 5 foot tall, with black pincer-like feet, large claws, glowing red eyes, and an upturned black mouth. Now, later in the summer of that year, another pair of girls heard a strange hiss from the trees before spotting the same birdman above them again. And the most recent sighting that I can come across is from 2011. So the owlman has certainly been bringing terror to the Cornish countryside for over 45 years. Although a lot of people insist that these sightings were hoaxes. So some people think they were inspired by author and magician Tony Doc Shields, and they think that he drew inspiration from West Virginian folklore of the Mothman. I don't know if any of you have come across the Mothman. He's very, very famous, and the American Mothman has inspired a lot of books, films, and there's even an annual Mothman festival in Point Pleasant which celebrates the creature. So there's this whole fascinating tourist industry around the cryptid, and even a statue for him in the middle of town. Now, aside from Doc Shields' theory, others insist that Owlman is a paranormal phenomena or even an alien being, but I'll leave it up to you to decide which one you think he might be. So having looked at folklore linked to forests more generally, I now want to focus down to the folklore of individual trees that can be found in our forests and woodlands. So at the very heart of the personality of the British landscape that I spoke about previously is the ancient tree. So ancient trees are common across America, Africa and Australia, but are relatively scarce across across Europe, with Britain and Poland being some of the few European countries who still have this rich woodland heritage. So they create quite a unique landscape and unique folklore compared to their other neighbours. Now in Britain, because of the types of trees we have here, these trees often have a relatively unique experience and can appear somewhat otherworldly. And this is due to the gnarly beauty of our veteran tree species. So these are most commonly yew or oak. These trees can enchant and enthrall and have inspired so many fairy stories and folk beliefs. So what makes a tree ancient or noteworthy? The trees that experts describe as ancient can vary from species to species. So many of the ancient trees in our landscape live for anything from 400 to 2,000 years and upwards. Now, some yew trees in particular are said to be over 5,000 years old by the communities that kind of have this battle to own the title of Britain's oldest tree, which of course comes with its own fame. You'll find so many Britain's oldest trees in the same way that you'll find thousands of Britain's oldest pubs as you travel through the countryside. Now, ancient trees usually have this very distinctive appearance that tend to comply with 3 key features. So we've got a wide trunk compared to others of the same species, a low squat shape, and a hollow in the trunk. So after kind of a few hundred years of life, these trees become kind of shriveled and knotted and twisted in something that I think is really kind of hauntingly beautiful. Over the years, these trees begin to be kind of focus points for the communities that live around them, and they're often put to a lot of different societal uses, which each bring their own stories and memories with them. So this includes everything from sacred altars, hideouts, watchtowers, playgrounds, shelters, execution sites, landmarks, boundary markers, and meeting places. So with these trees growing in importance for their communities as they age and become more kind of prominent, the stories and memories with them build as well, and they become more and more well known, and folklore begins to surround the trees as these stories are passed down between families and communities. So in some ways, and I can't remember who said this, but I took it from a wonderful book, these ancient and noteworthy trees act as a form of living archaeology. So they tell the history of a community through the rings marking the passage of time in their trunk and the stories shared between their roots and branches. So many people, myself included, find themselves drawn to these trees. I'm really terrible for making my partner just stop in the middle of a road and just have a look at a gnarly old tree on the side. But perhaps we're searching for something from an elusive past, identifying something divine amongst the foliage, or simply admiring their natural beauty. Now, forests, but more often specifically notable trees of great size or magical powers, also regularly feature in mythologies and religions from across the globe. So they're often used as symbols that reflect the link between the earth and the sky, with the branches creating a link to the unknown and the sacred. So just to give you some examples, we have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden in Christianity, and the Bodhi tree under which Buddha found enlightenment. We also have the great ash tree, Yggdrasil, in Norse mythology, that connected the realms of God and men, and the fig tree under which Rome was founded. So this sacred tree motif is really common across cultures, mythologies, and religions. Now, Yggdrasil, which is pictured here on this slide, acted as the central structure of the universe to those who believed, and in fact many people still do believe in the Norse pantheon. And its roots connect the 9 worlds and were tended by the Norns, which are the Norse equivalent of the Fates found in Greek or Roman mythology. Not featured on this image is my personal favourite Norse creature, which is Ratatosk, who is a squirrel whose job it is to run up and down Yggdrasil, delivering messages between the eagles perched on the top and the serpent Nidhogger that dwells at the roots. Now, Ratatosk was well known for passing along insults and rumours and fuelled the hatred between the eagles and the serpents as he went. So he's my favourite little folkloric creature. Anyway, back to the trees. These mythologized trees act as a sort of witness to the myths and sacred acts that occur underneath them. And the same might be said of Britain's ancient trees, who once witnessed acts long past from human memory. So when thinking of wooded landscapes and of individual ancient and notable trees, we often see them as kind of eternal, far outliving the people who live amongst them. Trees are thought to have seen the passage of vast swathes of time, and therefore it's only natural that people are curious about the stories that these trees can tell. Now, even today, many people still see trees as living magical things, and draw on these old mythologies and cultural traditions that give different trees different otherworldly properties. So groves of magical trees are still used as sacred sites around the world, with modern druids worshipping in ancient woodlands, and trees being of great importance to people who follow religions such as Shintoism and Buddhism. Again, I could spend a whole talk talking about the kind of subject of magical trees, but I just wanted to give you a couple of tree properties and why they've gained that reputation. So yew trees are possibly some of my favourite trees, and they're often found in our churchyards and graveyards. Now, there are various reasons cited for why this is the case, and they range from the poisonous leaves and branches keeping animals away from the churchyard, or making sure that the local farmers kept their stock well away so that they were safe. Others think that it was because yew thrived on the nutritious soil where corpses were buried, because the yew kept evil spirits away, and others suggest it was because the yews were sacred to the Druids, and the idea of sacred yew trees was never quite removed with the arrival of Christianity. So there's a few different theories there. Possibly the most gory theory I've ever heard is that the yew tree was specifically good at keeping the dead where they were supposed to be. So that's growing through their bones and keeping them where they're meant to be. Either way, the yew is known for its connection to the dead and is often related to divination and communication with the ancestors. I do just want to stress here how really poisonous almost every part of the yew is. So whether you're going for the leaf or the bark, it's very dangerous for humans or animals, so don't experiment making things from yew without professional guidance. The only safe bit of a yew tree is the flesh of its berry, but not the seed within. And I have eaten yew berry jam, and it's really not worth the danger foraging, so don't go there. This toxicity could explain its link in folkleaf to the dead and the spirits, though. Now, another of my favourite trees is the hawthorn, which is also known as Queen of the May and the fairy tree. So this is due to its links to fairy magic and springtime in folklore. So hawthorn was often used to enclose land because of its thorny and impenetrable nature. The leaves, fruits, and flowers have all been used in traditional herbal medicine. It's often linked to heart health in Chinese medicine, as well as the wants of the heart, so love potions and the like. And hawthorn is also known for its links to happiness and fertility. It's said that you should always ask permission before pruning or felling a hawthorn tree in case you should summon the wrath of the fairies that live there. I've included a few more properties of trees on this slide, but again, there's some really great books looking into magical and healing folk beliefs found in our forests. I personally would recommend Tree Wisdom by Jacqueline Patterson as a good all-rounder if you are interested. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the oak tree. So until the 18th century, people believed that Britain's ancient oaks were the oldest surviving trees in the world. And the oak trees are often referred to as the king of trees. Again, this could be because these are one of the longest standing, longest surviving trees in our landscape. Now, oaks are said to have played a key role in the religious practices of those historic Welsh priests known as the Druids. So the word Druid actually means oakman, as well as being sacred to Thor in Norse mythology and to Zeus and Jupiter in the Greek and Roman pantheons. So these are notably the patriarch and kings of each pantheon. Oak trees were also often used as boundary markers between villages alongside ancient standing stones and other landscape features. So it might be things like rivers, hills, and boulders. And as mentioned before, they're still thought of as magical by some communities in Britain today. So one of the most famous oak trees, which I'm going to talk about now, is the Major Oak, which was named for antiquarian Major Hayman Rook. So it's located in Sherwood Forest, Nottinghamshire, and it's famous for exactly what you might think of when we talk of Sherwood Forest, as we discussed earlier. The Major Oak is said locally to be the largest and most beautiful ancient tree in Britain, although, again, as I said, there are a lot of trees battling for this title across the country. Now, as you should be able to see in this image if Zoom is behaving properly, this tree is an almost perfect example of the ancient oak. So you can see it's got these deep roots, it's got a thick hollow trunk, which I think measured 11 feet last time they measured it. It's also got this wide canopy. Now, this was caused by pollarding, which is a form of traditional oak management that encourages new growth even after the tree was well established. So that's why you get these kind of wide canopies. Now, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Now, despite kind of national recognition, and many locals declaring otherwise, this tree is sadly neither the oldest or largest oak in the country. However, it's still said to be most famous due to the tree's links to that most famous legendary outlaw, Robin Hood. So the oak tree was said to be a meeting place for the merry men, and I'll just read this quote here for you. It is beneath, some say inside, this tree that the legendary Robin Hood, defender of the poor, is said to have met with his merry men. If this was the case, the Major Oak would have had to have reached a good size by the 13th century, making the tree possibly around 1,000 years old today. Now, the exact age of the Major Oak is really difficult to confirm. It's not very accurate when you're dating ancient oaks, but it's believed to be closer to the region of 500 years old rather than 1,000. So it's really important to consider age when thinking about the cultural heritage of ancient trees. You'll often find that the lore around them doesn't quite match up with the scientific evidence. So in the case of the Major Oak, it's unlikely that the tree's age is a match to the folklore. However, it doesn't stop hundreds of people visiting yearly to see Robin Hood's meeting place and flocking to the sites of many other of the oldest trees in Britain. So the Robin Hood Festival takes place around the Major Oak, and this is a free festival that's been taking place for over 40 years. They had a slight break during the COVID years for obvious reasons, but generally they see around 350,000 visitors, which enjoy 7 full-on days of reenactments, food and drink stalls, medieval music, sword fighting, have-a-go activities, the whole kind of wonderful medieval festival you might see at somewhere like Glastonbury as well. At the heart of the festival is the Major Oak, which helps to lend a sense of connection to the legend of the Robin Hood, even if this connection is somewhat of a dubious one. So visitors love to think that they're standing on the same soil where Robin Hood and his merry men once ate, slept and revelled in their stolen riches before giving to the poor of Nottinghamshire. So to me, the Major Oak is this link between the public imagination and the idea of a mythical past, which we really love to connect with. The Robin Hood story, as with many legends in the British Isles, it might have some basis in historical truth. As I mentioned earlier, it may even be that a band of outlaws did meet at the Major Oak at some point in history, even if the time frame doesn't quite match the scientifically measured age of the tree. But I think here the historical realities are not as important as the stories that are founded in folklore and in legends that have evolved through generations. So perhaps this legend has warped over time in a generation-long game of passed down whispers. But what it does provide, if not truth, is a reason for heritage tourists to visit the tree, the truth of the tree's story being far less important to the average visitor than the legend of the brave outlaw who robbed from the rich to give to the poor. Now, stories such as Robin Hood and the Major Oak help people to understand the value of these trees as part of our cultural heritage. So folklore helps to add a value to the tree or woodland by reminding us of these important relationships between people and trees. And promoting it can help protect the trees that are at risk from felling, road building, city planning, or by campaigning for things like tree preservation orders to be put onto them. These stories can also help to draw in tourists, which in turn helps to pay for the management costs associated with maintaining trees and woodlands. So if you looked in the previous slide, the major oak now needs support from things like metal poles and regular expensive maintenance, which stops the branches from collapsing entirely. Now in the past, far more extreme measures have been taken to keep the oak upright. So at one point there were metal chains attached to its branches. I think that was in the early 1900s. And at one point, the tree was completely filled with concrete and its limbs covered in lead and fiberglass, which kind of caused far more damage than it preserved. And tree safety is something that's often in our minds. I don't know if any of you saw there was a young girl killed in Southend where I used to live just a few days ago by a falling branch that had been propped up. So there really are a lot of costs and very, very important maintenance work that come alongside conserving trees. Now, the Tree of the Year campaign, which is run by the Woodland Trust, is held annually and winners are chosen by public vote. So in 2019, the prize for this was £1,000 worth of tree care, which sounds like a lot, but it really doesn't pay for a lot. But it does pay for specialist arboricultural support to maintain the well-being of these winning trees. So whilst the Tree of the Year campaign is designed to highlight both ecologically and historically significant trees, the winners have often been ancient trees that have this rich cultural heritage and plenty of stories to tell alongside them. And I think this is partially to these stories capture the country's imagination and inspire them to vote, and it is a voting contest. The Tree of the Year campaign has definitely been formidable in provoking things like support and sympathy for our ancient notable trees, as well as our wider forests and woodlands. Now, winners of the prestigious award have included things like Nellie's Tree in Leeds. If any of you are fellow Northerners, you might have heard of this one. It's locally known as the Love Tree, as it was grown in the shape of an N to woo a girl. I'm going to butcher the pronunciation on this one, I'm really sorry, but the Pilpridig Oak in Carmarthenshire, that is said to have hidden a king in the trunk, and of course the major oak was a winner as well. Now, the Allerton Oak in Liverpool was 2019's winner of the prestigious award, and I just thought I'd take a moment to tell you a little bit about the history of this wonderful tree and the stories and significance that brought these votes in. So as you can see from the slide here, the oak bears a large resemblance to the major oak, so its size, its shape are very similar. And the way it has been preserved through the support to its branches, you can see here, is very similar as well. So it's got these supports. Now, the cost for one of these supports was about £80,000, just to give you an idea of the kind of investment needed to keep these trees upright. So this one is 5.5 metres tall, and it produces 100,000 acorns every year. Now, this oak tree is believed to predate the Norman conquest in 1066, and according to local legend, it was once home to the medieval Hundred Court, as Allerton did not have a courthouse, and the tree was an ideal meeting place to make decisions for the community. There is, I don't know if you can see very well in this picture, but there's a large crack in the trunk of the tree, and that is said to have been caused by the explosion of a gunpowder ship, the Lottie Sleigh, in 1864. Now, it's said that this explosion was so powerful that authorities as far away as Chester inquired about the noise, and all of the windows in the nearby area were blown out. Now, I think it's quite unlikely that this was the cause of the tree splitting, but it does show in a lovely way how history and folklore can intertwine. And during World War II, soldiers' families would also send leaves and acorns home from this tree, or send them out to the front, to remind local soldiers of home and protect them from harm. Now, these stories caused a whopping 11,000 people to vote for it to be awarded Tree of the Year. So it beat the Dragon Oak Tree on the Isle of Wight, which is said to have been a dragon slain by a knight before it was turned to wood. And it also beat the Fallen Tree in Richmond Park that continues to grow despite being felled by a storm some years ago. Now, 2020's winner was, for me, at the time of working in East London, was very close to home, but this tree tells a lot sadder story. So those visiting the Woodbury Down area of Hackney at the time might have noticed the Happy Man tree, because it was often adorned with ribbons and messages, including the wonderful hashtag Notice This Tree. But sadly, these decorations didn't celebrate the award of the Tree of the Year, but were rather an attempt to stop the felling of the tree that meant so much to the local community. You can see someone's built a tree house at the top of it in this picture as well. Now, the Happy Man tree is about 150 years old, so it's not necessarily ancient, but it's certainly notable. And it's a plane tree. Now, plane trees are really fascinating. They were bred specifically to reduce pollution in London. Biodiversity-wise, they're a nightmare because the leaves don't decompose in the same way, but they really are great for inner city environments. So this is an old tree for its species, but they're certainly not old enough to have cemented itself into the story of London for generations and generations, but it was definitely important to the people of Hackney. Now, many local people recalled stories of meeting their first loves underneath the tree, or spending time with family and passing underneath its boughs. The tree was actually named after a now demolished pub, and the Tree of the Year contest, along with more DIY protests and community art projects, were used to draw attention to the tree's plight in a bid to save it from the redevelopment of the area. Now, sadly, despite the hard-fought efforts of campaigners who really did so much to share stories from the estate to bring the tree to national attention, and the admittance from developers that plans could have been altered to save it, this tree was felled on the 5th of January 2021. So I think this tree's story is a really poignant message of the love of the people around it that drew on memories and stories of the tree that was at the heart of the community that sadly fell on deaf ears. But I think it's definitely an important message for those wishing to fight the battle for other notable trees in danger from redevelopment, or things like HS2. So this is my plea to you all to shout about your tree stories before it gets to this stage, especially in the aftermath of things like heritage crimes such as the Sycamore Gap tree in Hadrian's Wall, which was callously felled in 2023. I'm just going to note here, however, that there are times when trees sadly cannot be saved, and it's really important to be aware of the horrifying effects of disease currently ravaging the UK's ash population, which is causing major safety issues as well as the awful loss of so many of our notable trees. So there are sometimes good reasons for the felling of trees. Now, despite cultural heritage tourism and campaigns such as the Tree of the Year being a great asset to preserving these trees, especially through things like protection orders and increased funding to care and maintain for them, an increase of visitor numbers can also pose a great risk to the trees we as communities are trying really hard to protect. So referring back to the major oak again here, increased visitor numbers have begun to compact the ground around the tree's roots, which causes poor soil structure and restrictions to root development. And it can also increase the risk of the tree being blown down in stormy weather. That's just from visitors trampling over the soil. The major oak has now been fenced off to ensure its future, and so that visitors can really enjoy a tangible glimpse of the legend of Robin Hood for many years to come. Now, this has begun to be quite a familiar setup for a lot of ancient and notable trees across Britain, as a lot of our well-loved and visited trees are at risk from things like climbing, tree hugging, ground compactation, as well as contemporary tree customs that include carving names into trees, leaving coins and other offerings, tying ribbons to branches, or a lot of people are still taking home parts of these trees as souvenirs. So all of these little rituals that are often seen as honouring the tree can have huge negative effects on their health and lifespan of the trees in question. Now, the Fortingall yew, which is one of my favourite trees in the UK, is a great example of a tree that sustained considerable damage through tourism and human interaction. So this one is famous for being the oldest tree in Britain, another one of them, but the age of this tree is estimated to be anything from 2,000 to 5,000 years old. The legend of the Fortingall yew suggests that Pontius Pilate, who was the 5th governor of the Roman province of Judea, was either born under or played under the tree as a child. So if this were to be true, which is unlikely, the tree must have already reached veteran status over 2,000 years ago, just to give you an idea of the age there. Now, this tree is next to an Edwardian church, so this grows in the churchyard there. This was built on the ruins of an older monastery. Now, some suggest that many monasteries were built on sites that were already sacred to the surrounding communities. If this is the case, it could indicate that the yew tree was in itself a pre-Christian sacred site, although this really is far from evidenced. But there are things like Neolithic burials and Bronze Age standing stones discovered very close by, so it might have some potential as a theory, potentially. Yew trees have really had this sacred significance as symbols of death, the underworld, sorrow and mourning, even as far back as ancient Egypt, so it's potential. Now, despite the long survival of this kind of ancient Fortingall yew, the tree's in real danger now, and it's become so stressed that it's actually changed sex. So with plants and trees, you do think of sex as binary, and berries shouldn't be appearing on a male tree, and they appeared back in 2015 because of the destruction that's happening around the Fortingall yew. Now, destructive ritual interaction with the tree has been evidenced as far back as 1838, when the Reverend Robert MacDonald wrote of boys burning fires at the roots of the yew tree during the Beltane Festival on the 1st of May, and this ritual destruction seems to have carried forward right into the present day. So despite a high wall around it, which you can just see in this picture here, really high wall, that's made of stone and iron, encircles the whole of the tree. Visitors still climb over in order to tie ribbons and beads to the tree, which is less harmful as breaking off branches, which a lot of people do to take home as souvenirs. So just to finish off this talk, I wanted to quickly mention one of my favourite ways in which we engage with wooded landscapes today that are both beautiful but also occasionally damaging. This is something I'm conducting some studies into at the moment, to find out exactly what it is that draws people who might not be religious or spiritual to leave colourful offerings, as you see in this slide here. So this is from St Nectan's Glen in Cornwall, which is an absolutely stunning area that's known for being this fantastically magical place with a 60-foot waterfall that appears through a hole in the rocks there. And to get to it, you have to go through this beautiful canopy of ancient Cornish woodland. So this is a clootie tree, which is sometimes known as wishing trees or rag trees, and they've become one of the most well-known ways in which people ritually engage with trees in contemporary Britain. So clootie trees are traditionally located next to holy wells or springs, so such as the clootie tree at the Black Isle in Mullochy in Scotland, but clooties and other offerings are now found on hundreds of notable trees across Britain and are very much a feature in our wooded landscapes. So historically, a clootie is a length of ribbon or a fabric strip that's tied to branches as a symbol of pilgrimage, or perhaps as a request for a cure for illness. And the idea was that as the offering kind of rotted, your illness would be washed away. So despite attempts to suppress this Catholic custom during the Reformation, this ritual in some way has continued, although perhaps not with the same intentions. My research has often shown that these offerings are now left here as symbols of things like memorialisation, grief, pilgrimage, or even just a simple note of I was here. Now, these offerings are certainly now being found at many non-well related notable and sacred trees across Britain. So for those of you in the local area, you might have seen the Tolkien trees, which are a group of ancient beech trees in Avebury, where Tolkien is said to have been inspired to write the Ents in Lord of the Rings. And they are absolutely covered in offerings very, very regularly. I've seen everything from beautiful ribbons and handmade bead bracelets right the way through to 1960s shoes thrown into the top of the tree there. Now, however beautiful they may be to look at, and I really do think they are lovely with their bright coloured offerings hanging from every branch, these clooties can be really damaging for the trees themselves. So most ritual ribbons left hanging are now made of cheap synthetic non-biodegradable fibres as opposed to kind of natural materials that would have been way back in the end of the 16th century. And they don't rot in the way they did in the past. So they leave a lot more issues for people who are managing these trees, and they also cause issues for wildlife. So a lot of the time you'll find things like birds getting stuck in them. And there's a lot of community groups that are campaigning for these trees to be cleared and a notion of leave no trace to be installed in visitors. And you will see signs at Avebury that say please leave no trace. So just to conclude very quickly, our forests and woodlands have this really rich cultural heritage, and they form a vital part of the personality of the British landscape because of the things they've witnessed, both in evidence history and in the mythic past, their unusual beauty, the stories we've shared both in them and about them, and the ways in which we have interacted with trees from prehistory right up to the present day. And I really think that even as we face challenges of things like an increasingly urban environment, in fact, I might even say because of it, our wooded landscapes are going to continue to inspire folklore and ritual for many generations. So I just want to say thank you so much for listening. I've gone for exactly 40 minutes, which is quite impressive for me, David. But if any of you want to follow me on social media, my handles are on the slide there, as are my work and university emails. I also said that I'd quickly recommend a few books to read if anyone's interested in learning more. So Gossip from the Forest by Sarah Maitland and Woodland Folktales by Lisa Schnadow are wonderful starting points for anyone interested in learning more about the folklore of the forest. And if you're interested in ancient cultural heritage of trees, I recommend Richard Murr's Ancient Trees, Living Landscapes as well. I think that's everything, David.
Fantastic. Thank you, Claire. And what we'll do is we'll ask you to put the list of books together, and we'll email that out to people so that they can follow that up afterwards. So absolutely fantastic. And you win the prize for getting some modern cultural references into your talk, slipping them in without anyone noticing.
Thank you,
Variant
David.
on buzzword bingo.
Lovely.
So over to you all now, to ask Claire any questions. You could take your mouse down to the bottom where you see the chat button and type in there to use the chat button, or if you're feeling brave, you could turn on your microphone and ask a question there. So Is
book
anyone?
references much appreciated. Just come up in the chat. I will definitely send those round. There's some fantastic stuff out there. In fact, if you go into most National Trust bookshops as well, Liz, you will find some fascinating books on the cultural history of trees nowadays.
Yeah.
Hi, that was
Okay.
fantastic.
Thank you, Ruth. Glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, yeah, very, very interesting. I mean, I'm interested in all that, have been for years as well. So for the way you explained it and that, I learned a lot more as well. So that's wonderful. Thanks. You explained it very well.
Thank you. Really appreciate that.
Yeah. I go to Avebury actually quite a lot, and I go to the moons, the circles there, the Gorsedd and that, that's the group that are removing all the ribbons from the beech trees, because like you say, like it's more synthetic now, so apparently it can strangle the branches.
That's
Because
right.
I always quite admired, all the offerings, but for that reason they've been taking them down. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
there's some really interesting conversations around what you do with these offerings when you take them down. Like,
Yeah,
do they belong in museum collections? What are the ethical implications of
yeah.
collecting them when, especially when they're memorializing grief or the passing of a loved one or something similar?
Mm.
Should they be placed on a sacred altar or should they be put in a bin bag and thrown away?
I
Yeah, I don't
know,
have the
yeah,
answers. It's
that's
just an
true,
interesting
yeah.
discussion. And I know in
Mm.
Cornwall there's a lot of groups that are doing very similar and going around and traveling through all these
Is there,
ancient
yeah.
sites and clearing them
Mm.
up. So.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Okay.
interesting, yeah.
Right. Thank you, Ruth. And we've got a question from Jill, who says, "Can you tell us more about the big belly oak in Savernake Forest?"
Jill, I wish I could, but I found very little about it in terms of folklore beyond the if you run backwards naked, you might summon the devil. So if anyone has anything that they'd like to share with me on the Big Belly Oak, I would love to hear it. I've even been through our collections, David, and found very, very little about this one.
Yeah, there's a few pictures of it, but there's very little beyond that from memory.
I know it's in quite a sorry for itself state at the moment. I think it's becoming quite at risk of falling to pieces as that kind of trunk gets more and more hollow, which is a real shame because it's quite eye-catching as you drive down the road, isn't it?
And I think it's got hit by the odd car as well, which doesn't exactly help.
If I find anything out, Jill, I'll be sure to share it with the group. So.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions? Anything they'd like to say? I'm very intrigued by it. Lucy, yeah, over to you.
I don't have a question, but I just want to say, Claire, that was really amazing. And I particularly enjoyed your humour. And I was very sad that we were all on mute, so you couldn't hear me laughing.
I'm glad I made someone giggle.
Possibly just as well.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Lucy.
Yes, and as you know, we've discussed the yew at Alton Barnes, which again is very old and reputedly dates back to the Roman period, although on what basis I have no idea. And personally, I'm really intrigued by this idea that churches have taken over sort of sites that were pagan, or sacred in some way to the pagans. Do you know of other examples? You mentioned one.
I'm trying to remember which henge it is where there's a church built in the henge, so that's where that comes from rather than trees. Can you remember where it is? It's down in Dorset somewhere, David.
The Knowlton henge.
That's the one. I think that's where that kind of theory originates. But most places, if there's an old yew in a churchyard, will tell you that it's because it's an ancient sacred site that's been reused by the Christian community. But obviously, there's so little in terms of written record about when these places were formed. It's really difficult to prove one way or another. I think there's a bit of me that would like to believe it's true, David, even if it potentially isn't, you know.
And the idea of boring into an ancient yew tree to count the rings doesn't quite seem right, does it?
No, you can do it without harming the trees, but it really is inaccurate. So I'm not sure it would give you anywhere close to what the evidence that we're looking for, really. So
yeah. Okay, we have a question from Doug and Judith. Can you say something about Twin Oaks, which is gypsy law?
Well, I don't know anything about this, Doug and Judith. I don't suppose you'd like to say anything about what you know. You don't have to. There's no pressure if you don't want to come on camera. But it's not what I know about, I'm afraid.
Okay. while they're thinking about it, Liz has said, I was interested to hear about apologising when cutting down hawthorn. I've heard about apologising when cutting down elderberry, as you let the evil spirits out.
Yeah, there's a few trees that you should apologise to when cutting them down. Elder is because elder's often related to witchcraft, so there's a lot of stories of witches being turned into elder. And I think, and don't quote me on this one, I think elder is also the tree that was meant to be used for the crucifixion of Christ. So I think there's another level of kind of negative spirits around that one, but again, I'd have to triple check. I'm trying to think of the other trees that you should apologise to. I think you're also meant to apologise when you cut down blackthorn for similar reasons. But it's great. I suggest just apologising to all trees before you prune them, Liz. I think that's just the safest way to do things. There are fairies hidden everywhere.
Yeah, and with ash dieback, they're particularly vulnerable at the moment.
Yeah,
it's quite depressing when you're out walking at the moment.
It's quite scary seeing the amount of trees that we're potentially losing. It's the same we saw with Dutch elm disease back in the 90s and early 2000s. So you'll see very little elm in the British countryside anymore, which is a real shame, but done for safety reasons. So.
Are there any stories about ash trees that you know of?
Ash trees, that's linked to Yggdrasil again. So the ash tree was meant to be the tree that connected those 9 worlds that I spoke about, but it's also supposed to be the tree that Odin hung himself from to gain the wisdom of the runes and the weird. So that's mostly what I know about. I think there's a story around ash trees as well, because it makes this really like beautiful rustling sound that it's meant to be kind of a forgetfulness tree. But that might be lime. I'll double check that one for you, David.
Okay, thank you. And I see Liz has said, blimey, she didn't realise how many trees keep us safe from evil spirits, which is always a good thing.
I think if you plant rowan in front of your front door, that's meant to keep you safe from witchcraft as well, just in case you wanted another one to add to the collection.
Good plan, good plan. Okay. We have Lucy has posted Twin Oaks in the Hedgerows. There's some info here about a gypsy story for burying a child with an acorn in each hand.
Oh, that's really interesting. I'll have to look into that one. Thank you so much for sharing that with me.
Gosh.
There is so much out there when you get into tree lore. It's almost impossible for you to know everything, especially when you get into kind of Romany cultures and things like that. It's fascinating, could keep someone occupied for a very, very long time. I think the top expert on plant and tree lore out there at the moment is Roy Vickery, who does, I think he's based down in Kent, but he's the top man if you want to know more about plant and tree folklore.
Yeah. Okay, well, with that, I think we'll call that a day. Thank you so much for your talk, Claire. Thanks everyone for coming. And as I say, we'll get the select book list. I'm not quite sure how they say it when they're talking in the sort of on the radio. Select list out to you. And so huge thanks, Claire, for an absolutely fascinating talk. And thanks for coming. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.